Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about Rudolf Steiner's The Philosophy of Freedom. I'm going to be mainly reading from and commenting on two chapters. Chapter 11, World Purpose and Life Purpose, The Ordering of Mankind's Destiny, and Chapter 12, Moral Imagination, Darwinism, and Morality. So if you don't know about Rudolf Steiner, he lived from 1861 to 1925. He was born in the area that is now Croatia. And he had sort of like a spiritual philosophy. He has more philosophic, what would be considered classical, traditional philosophical books to some extent. And then he has writings that are more on the esoteric side. And he called his particular spiritual philosophy anthroposophy, which means the wisdom of the human being. And as I'm beginning to go through Steiner's work, so I am maybe about midpoint in the Riddles of Philosophy, and I'm almost finished with the Philosophy of Freedom. So I plan to read more of his works, but what I'm kind of getting from him so far is that he would very much align with, in my mind, the New Thought movement, where that focuses on the law of attraction and manifestation and just being the agent of your own reality in a very material way. But also, I wonder if Jean-Paul Sartre was influenced by him and read him, because I see a lot of existentialism of Sartre's inclination. I would see, I don't know if Heidegger read him, but I would see that influence. Steiner read Nietzsche. So all of those philosophers would, I really see a lot of alignment with. So he would be considered maybe a mystic of his own right, because he based especially a lot of his esoteric works, or his occultist works almost, maybe you would say, on direct knowledge and his own perception of spiritual dimensions. So he saw himself as initiating, and he did initiate, a modern sort of science of spirit that is accessible to anyone. So I think it's really interesting when clairvoyants or channelers, etc., say that really everyone has that ability to connect with and communicate with other dimensions. So he influenced a lot of different areas of life, including education. There are schools based on his teachings and his sort of perspective and methods, agriculture, medicine, economics, architecture, etc. So there are so many schools, clinics, farms, and various other organizations that are involved in sort of work that's based on his ideas. And he has written, I think, around 30 books. He's delivered thousands of lectures across Europe. And in 1924, he founded the General Anthroposophical Society, which has branches throughout the world. So the Philosophy of Freedom, which is what I am going to be reading, the full title is The Philosophy of Freedom. So you can imagine he's going to talk about freedom versus determinism. And I think he has a pretty existentialist understanding of freedom. And he really sees something very special in human beings. Okay, so the Philosophy of Freedom, the philosophy of spiritual activity. So that's what he wanted to call this. So freedom and morality to be moral, he says you need to be free. And thought is a process of the soul or of the spirit. It is a spiritual activity. And so I see a lot from what I'm reading in Heidegger, what is called thinking, because he also talks about true, authentic thinking is going to be something that's sacred and spiritual and meditative. So The Philosophy of Freedom was first published in 1894 when he was 32 years old. During this time, he was also editing some of Goethe's scientific writings, and he was also working on, with others, and sort of a compilation of Schopenhauer's works. Some of the other works that he has written, his doctoral thesis was called Truth and Knowledge. One of the books I'm thinking of getting next is called Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path. And then in 1901, Mysticism at the Dawn of Modern Age. 1902, Christianity as a Mystical Fact. I always think it's good to kind of look at the titles of what someone, if you're just kind of becoming familiar with a philosopher, to look at what they've written and the titles, because it'll just tell you a lot about, the subject area that they are preoccupied with. Then there is Theosophy, an introduction to the spiritual processes in human life and the cosmos. The other book that I'm thinking about getting next is How to Know Higher Worlds, Modern Path of Initiation. Then he has Cosmic Memory, Prehistory of Earth and Man. So that's in 1904. That sounds super interesting. Probably some connections to the last sections of the Republic and the Timaeus, I would think. Another book he has is called The Education of the Child. Another one is The Way of Initiation. And then in 1910, An Outline of Esoteric Science. And then in 1925, Fundamentals of Therapy, an extension of the art of healing through spiritual knowledge. And he has also written something called Friedrich Nietzsche, Fighter for Freedom. So that's pretty much his list. Not all of the works, but just the ones that sort of stand out to me. All right, so as usual, I haven't planned so much. I don't have an outline for this. I'm just going to maybe read some of the lines that I highlighted and see what we can say about them. So this is chapter 11, Will Purpose and Life Purpose, the Ordering of Mankind's Destiny. And right there, I see that, okay, so if it's called World Purpose and Life Purpose, there might be, he might be saying, this might give us a clue if we haven't read it yet, that there's going to be some sort of aim or goal or reason for living and path that we should take, kind of thinking like, for instance, when I'm reading the Gnostics felt that while you were on this earth, it's your job to save yourself and to not be distracted by material sort of happenings or entities, but to devote yourself, kind of like a medieval mystic, to allowing your soul to reveal itself. I might be using Kabbalist language here as well, because it's also in the Kabbalah. So you have to create space in your mind and in your body to forget about yourself as a material being, and so that you can be in this state where you can receive knowledge and connect with the divine, and so that it would say, like in the Kabbalah, be in continuous communion with God, and having even mundane activities be something that's sacred and something that adds to the elevating of the consciousness of the collective. But as I have read the chapter, and I could be wrong, but I don't think he talks so much, or maybe even agrees with, like, let's say Hegel, that there is sort of like in the evolution of humankind and just the world in general, that there is necessarily a purpose, or he tries to separate in his humanism at least, the purpose that can be achieved by human beings, and that is kind of absent from nature and natural law. He is kind of speaking not against, but in a corrective to science and natural science. So in the ordering of mankind's destiny, so that's interesting that there's like an order, a structure, kind of again, like maybe he's going to provide some direction for this. So he says true purposefulness really exists only if in contrast to the relationship of cause and effect. True purposefulness really exists only if in contrast to the relationship of cause and effect. So when I think of cause and effect, I think of something very scientific that can be observed, that, one thing causes another, and it's sort of, there's a predictability to it, there's a certainty to it, and it's a natural law. So he wants to map out, in comparison, in relationship, true purposefulness that human beings can enact. He says, for there to be a purposeful connection, this detour through the mental picture is absolutely necessary. So when he talks about the mental picture, he's talking about the intention in the human being, that we can only make our actions filled with purpose if we lay the foundation of our intention. And that intention will have to do with visualization and imagination, and even a sort of technical skill that helps us go from our mental picture or intention through action to seeing it through in manifestation. So there is the cause and effect in the natural world that is there. But he says that we can form and create new principles for ourselves. When I'm reading W.D. Waddell's 1910, The Science of Getting Rich, that's kind of what he says. He says that, like, everything that is created, we can affect creation, and we can create out of, what he calls formless substance. So he says, if the effect is to have a real influence upon the cause, it can do so only by means of the conceptual factor. So with intention, we're not kind of following sort of external authorities or our impulses or our instincts sort of mindlessly, so that, we're kind of going through life, and then whatever happens, we don't really try to visualize it or envision it. Rather, it just is going to happen. So we need to, in a sense, like, you can think about like the discussion about goals and vision boards and things like that. We need to think about the effect before the cause, and to have a more, I would say, like, back and forth flow between them, instead of something just that's unidirectional. So I think that's really interesting that he inverts or reverses the usual direction of cause and effect. So he says, for a purposeful connection to exist, so it's not just that we're submitting to whatever effects happen from our cause. And a lot of people do live by like this, even myself. It does take a skill, it does take practice to live in the way that Steiner is wanting us to live, thinking about the effects, having an intention, and sustaining sort of our self-creation and our self-evolution through the coupling of intention with our action, with the vision. So for a purposeful connection to exist, it is not only necessary to have an ideal, law-determined connection between the latter and the earlier, but the concept law of the effect must really influence the cause. That is, so the effect almost, because you can think about an intention almost being a cause, but also being an effect, because when you're putting an intention out there, when you're putting energy out there, it is future directed. You're envisioning what your life will be at that moment in the future. That is by means of a perceptible process. A perceptible influence of a concept upon something else, however, is to be observed only in human actions. Hence, this is the only sphere in which the concept of purpose is applicable. So here you see what I was saying about his humanistic bent. So let's see. That's really what he's talking about in this section. So he says, and here's an example of his, what I see as his existentialism. He says, human life can only have the purpose and the ordering of destiny that man gives it. To the question, what is man's task in life? There can be, for monism, but one answer. And monism is what he ascribes to maybe just conditionally, like just in the realm of human beings. I don't know. I'm trying to remember earlier in the text how he talked about it. But he doesn't necessarily have like the specific monism of, say, Leibniz. Okay, so my mission in the world, okay. The task he sets himself. So what is man's task in life? The answer, the task he sets himself. My mission in the world is not predetermined, but is at every moment the one I choose for myself. Doesn't that sound like Sartre's existentialism, freedom, being metaphysical, agency, and responsibility? He says that all such phrases, okay, so I'll start at the beginning of this paragraph. He says, ideas are realized purposefully only by human beings. Consequently, it is not permissible to speak of the embodiment of ideas by history. All such phrases as history is the evolution of mankind towards freedom, or the realization of the moral world order, and so on, are untenable from a monistic point of view. So it could be that I'm not understanding this, but I feel as that I wonder if he's speaking against Hegel and against sort of a collective evolution. So I don't know. That's my question. You tell me. And he talks about instincts in nature and various impulses, and his idea of the thinking process that indicates to us that we have the ability to be free and allows us to be free. I don't know where I was going. What was I going to say? I think it only happens in human beings, and it is in opposition to, okay, this is what I was going to say. It is in opposition to instincts, impulses, religious authority, the external standards of your culture. It's something that you have to create. It's something that, it almost seems to me like it's something that is rational. Although that might be like not the best articulation. So he says we must not confuse a certain kind of lawfulness, nature's lawfulness, with that of subjective human action. So we know that human action, human freedom can exist because it exists in the subjective ideal that every human being can sort of manifest and then utilize in the direction of, realizing and manifesting whatever they want. So he says, for monism, with the rejection of an absolute cosmic being, never experienced but only hypothetically inferred, all ground for assuming purposes in the world and in nature also falls away. And then he has these different authors' comments that he wrote in 1918. And he says that, which this is a really helpful statement, he says that in this book, the thinking process is presented as a purely spiritual one. So I think that's really helpful. So going on, so that was chapter 11. We went through that pretty quickly. So now going on to the second chapter, chapter 12. This is moral imagination, Darwinism, and morality. And I think I'm on the chapter of Darwinism and like world conception and riddles. I don't know. Okay, so in this one, I think it's really interesting. He does critique religion. He really talks about the ways in which human beings are free and are not determined, but also the ways that most people allow themselves to be determined. For instance, he says that for a free spirit, this is just the first line, a free spirit acts according to his impulses, that is, according to intuitions, selected from the totality of his world of ideas by thinking. For an unfree spirit, the reason why he singles out a particular intuition from his world of ideas in order to make it the basis of an action lies in the world of percepts given to him, that is, in his past experiences. So basically, the unfree are dictated by their past. That's one way you can be determined, allowing yourself to be determined. He recalls before coming to a decision what someone else has done or recommended as suitable in a comparable case, or what God has commanded to be done in such a case, and so on, and he acts accordingly. So this is the unfree spirit. This is what you should not do. And so for the free spirit, though, in contrast, in this chapter, he's kind of, in the beginning, he's kind of going back and forth, comparing. So for a free spirit, he makes a completely first-hand decision. What others have done in such a case worries him as little as what they have decreed. So this made me think about, and I was thinking all through this chapter, especially with the religious aspect. Since he's very against prescriptions, I was wondering, because I haven't read any more of the Swedenborg since like the last video that I made about the book haul or the books that I'm reading. Sorry. But I'm wondering if he would like what Swedenborg is saying, because what I find problematic is that He's talking about how if you do X, you will get rewarded with Y. Sorry, I'm going to have to pause for just a second. Okay, sorry, I'm back. I had to take a sip of water. So I'm wondering, because Steiner says that you really shouldn't base, if you want to be free, you really shouldn't base your decision on whether you'll be rewarded or punished, mostly by your conscience or that you have created by internalizing the external or by religion, etc. And it just makes me wonder if what Swedenborg is doing is describing or if he's prescribing. And also if it matters. If someone describes, won't the reader be at risk at prescribing for himself? Like, can I read Swedenborg and not want to be a beautiful soul just to have a beautiful appearance in heaven? You know, can you shelve that and go back to your original, like, more pure, healthier motivations? Because, you know, that's such a superficial motivation. So he says, so also when he says what others have done in such a case worries, you know, whatever the case is, worries him as little as what they have decreed. This also made me think of Heidegger, when Heidegger is talking about in Being in Time that to be authentic, we have to maybe be aware of our thrownness toward the they, but also be resolute in our own sort of actions and thinking so that we can expand the possibilities instead of just inheriting those possibilities. So basically, to be free, you must direct and create your causes and effects. And then he goes on to talk about morality, and basically to be morally productive, he argues that one must have imagination. And he critiques rules and says that rules have less value for acting positively than for just refraining from certain actions. So he says, laws take on the form of general concepts only when they forbid actions, but not when they prescribe them. Laws concerning what he ought to do must be given to the unfree spirit in quite concrete form. Clean the street in front of your door, pay your taxes, amounting to the sum given here, and so on. Conceptual form belongs to laws for inhibiting actions. Thou shalt not steal, that thou shalt not commit adultery. These laws, too, influence the unfree spirit only by means of a concrete mental picture. So basically, I'll just continue this because it's pretty good. For example, that of the appropriate secular punishment or the pangs of conscience or eternal damnation. So you can either borrow, adopt, inherit, feel restricted to engage the mental pictures of society or culture or the world or tradition, or you can create your own intention, your own visualization, regardless of the limitations and the structures that you observe. So later he says, for the free spirit who is impelled neither by an example nor by fear of punishment or the like, this translation of the concept into a mental picture is always necessary. So I think it's really interesting, the importance of having a mental picture in your mind before you act and while you are acting to manifest what you intend. He says that man produces concrete mental pictures from the sum of his ideas, chiefly by the means of the imagination. So here is the valued imagination that I was seeing in the Kabbalah. Therefore, what the free spirit needs in order to realize his ideas, in order to be effective, is moral imagination. I think it's interesting how he brings in morality and ethics in this chapter. He says, this is the source of the free spirit's action. Therefore, it is only people with moral imagination who are, strictly speaking, morally productive. That's interesting. I've read this idea in other places as well, that the true, and I think maybe in Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, existentialist literature, that to be truly moral, you have to have agency. You have to be your own person and have intention and navigate life reflectively and thinkingly. You have to know yourself, and you have to also create yourself. And in doing this, you are truly moral. It might have been in Ayn Rand as well. All right, so he says that those who merely preach morality, that is, people who merely spin out moral rules without being able to condense them into concrete mental pictures, are morally unproductive. They are like those critics who can explain very intelligibly what a work of art ought to be like, but who are themselves incapable of even the slightest productive effort. So it's all talk and no substance and no depth. He says moral imagination, in order to realize its mental picture, must set to work in a definite sphere of percepts. Human action does not create percepts, but transforms already existing percepts and gives them a new form. So this is what I was referring to when I was mentioning the science of getting rich and creating from the formless spirit that wants to create and give you life. So he says, in order to be able to transform a definite object of perception or a sum of such objects in accordance with a moral mental picture, one must have grasped the principle at work within the percept picture, that is, the way it has hitherto worked. Hitherto? I don't know how to pronounce that. I don't say that word often, or at all. Which one gives, although I put it in writing, so, which one wants to give a new form or a new direction. So it's all about the new. It's all about generating and creating as if we were gods ourselves or divine. Further, it is necessary to discover the procedure by which it is possible to change the given principle into a new one. So here you start to see in this articulation this science of spirituality. He says that moral action then presupposes, in addition to the faculty of having moral ideas or moral intuition and moral imagination, the ability to transform the world of percepts without violating natural laws by which these are connected. So we are in the world, we're not necessarily doing some kind of witchcraft that bends gravity or bends the natural world. We're working with and through what is already here to manifest something new. So I think there's a slight difference and maybe something, to think about. He says, I don't know, I laugh because I see myself in one of these. So he says, it is perfectly possible for people without moral imagination to receive such mental pictures from others and to embody them skillfully into the actual world. So, for instance, we can read something and not necessarily, maybe there are people who don't necessarily add anything to it or make that reading their own, but they kind of follow it and it works and they do it well in the right way, and there's manifestation. Conversely, and this is me, it may happen that people with moral imagination lack technical skill and must make use of others for the realization of their mental pictures. So any of you listening, help me with my moral imagination. No, but I think that So he's saying that we need both imagination and technical skill. So it's not just that we take in and we believe and we have faith and we dwell on certain ideas. We have to put them into practice. So I would say, for instance, a particular example would be putting in the time and bodily effort for meditation. Meditation is a way to sort of uncover the intentions of your soul and to visualize in terms of manifestation. So how do you gain technical skill, right? Like the Kabbalah talks about, maybe it already assumes that you know Hebrew, but understanding Hebrew, understanding the permutations of the letters and numerical values of the alphabet, and studying the Torah and studying under people, etc. Right? So there's different things that you need to do, like even the Gnostics will say this, to gain your technical skill and be better at going into a meditative state, sort of transitioning from certain, brainwave frequencies to others. He says that ethics I think I've skipped something actually. Okay, no, that's fine. He says ethics as a science that sets standards cannot exist, or really should not exist. He says some people have wanted to maintain the standard-setting character of moral laws, at least insofar as they have understood ethics. But he says our moral life is not comparable with the life of the organism, so we can't necessarily look at the general rules from an organism's requirements in life as a basis for influencing the body in a particular way. We can't take a one-to-one or literal adoption from science to our moral and spiritual journeys and selves. He says that moral laws, so basically ethics as a science that sets standards cannot exist because moral laws are first created by us. So we cannot apply them until we have created them. He says that the error arises through the fact that, as regards their content, moral laws are not newly created at every moment, but are inherited. Those that we have taken over from our ancestors appear to be given like the natural laws of the organisms. But a later generation will certainly not be justified in applying them as if they were sacred rules. So morality is something that's created by human beings. This is his opinion. It's not something that derives from, it seems like he's saying, from our sort of innate, deterministic inner selves, or something in nature or the world, or something that is just concrete universal wisdom. I might be corrected the more I read this, but it seems like he's not going down that path. He's going down the path that morality, at least, is a construction. And so we need to keep that in mind. And that's very Nietzsche, right? Thinking about how he has talked about in the gay science, in the genealogy of, I think it is, that's what it's called, the genealogy of morality. He talks about how we have to look at the history of certain subjects or entities like morality, and we see that a lot of it is random, or a lot of it is driven by agendas, or a lot of it is just taken non-thinkingly or created non-thinkingly. And so if this is the case, if there's no religious edict, if there's no rhyme or reason, then why don't we strike out on our own? Why don't we at least think about what we're doing and consider it? Oh, and then I need to have a light. So just a second. Let me give myself light because it's now 4:30. So, okay. Oh, winter. So morality is not natural. Morality is not innate. All right, so let's see. I'm gonna skip this part. Okay, so it's just kind of repeating that idea. All right, so he's talking about evolution again, and he's talking about what we can and can't draw from the natural world, especially since this is a chapter on Darwinism and morality, from the evolution of organisms. He says, in the process of evolution of the moral world order, we accomplish something that at a lower level is accomplished by nature. We alter something perceptible. So I think that's so fascinating because he's saying right here, he's looking at evolution. He's saying, you know what I see from evolution? I see that we can apply that to the spiritual. I see that we can apply that to the conscience. And we have the power for our own evolution. And this is what various spiritual traditions say, that human beings are in a particular position. And so maybe this, maybe I'm a little bit humanist. No, I mean, I don't know. Never mind. No, I don't think that, I would say that it's just humans. I don't know. We could talk about my own spiritual or cosmology later. But let's just go with what is said here. Humans are in a special position to make great strides in the evolution of their souls, their spirits, their conscience, or consciousness. That's the right word. So I think this is really fascinating, that's what he sees, that's what he takes. And he names what he's talking about. He articulates his particular kind of morality, which I see as existentialist and humanistic, as ethical individualism. So we can't necessarily universalize. So this is really sort of against Kant, right? And the categorical imperative. We can't really universalize. We have to start from the individual and follow the path of the individual. He says the individual is morally barren unless he has moral ideas of his own. He says the appearance of completely new moral ideas through the moral imagination is, for the theory of evolution, no more miraculous than the development of a new animal species out of an old one. So, I definitely see Nietzsche here again. And so he's kind of responding to the potential protests that, this is allowed, this is good, this is possible. He's saying it's no more miraculous. If you look at evolution among the organisms and various species in the natural world, why can't our spirit evolve like that? Why can't we do that in a self-sustaining way? All right, so let's see. We just have a couple more pages and some really exciting quotes about religion coming up. So he says that what he's talking about is a spiritualized theory of evolution. He's spiritualizing the theory of evolution. And he says that ethical individualism has nothing to fear from a natural science that understands himself. He says, if a person finds that an action is the image of such an ideal intuition, and this is the ideal intuition is what is human, is what is needed, is that mental picture that is ideal subjectively for us. for the individual, then he feels it to be free. In this characteristic of an action lies its freedom. So the ideal is always free as it is ideal to ourselves. So the unspiritual theory of evolution, or the material theory of evolution, it does not produce the subjective ideal. It only perfects for that particular species, or some members of the species, for a particular temporal environment, very specific. And it doesn't necessarily respond to the subjective wishes and wants and desires of the members of the species, but it's just aligning for, like, let's say, survival or weeding out or something. But so it's only ourselves, it's only our individuals who can understand our own wishes and desires. And it's important that we just can desire. And this has limitations, right? If we're brainwashed, if we submit to a particular world order or philosophy that's not our own, or that we didn't really think through to adopt as our own. So he says here, kind of going along, I'll just read the quote that I'm trying to describe. He says, to be free means to be able. Okay, so he says that there's a difference between the two propositions. To be free means to be able to do as one wills. And so he's sort of not choosing this proposition, but he's saying that this is how people usually think of freedom. Like, I'm only free if I'm able to do something. I'm unfree because there are visa restrictions and I can't stay in a country for longer than 3 months, speaking from my past experience and adventures, or misadventures, really. Or I'm not free because, so he's discounting actually what Simone de Beauvoir wrote about as important in the Ethics of Ambiguity in response to Jean-Paul Sartre's emphasis in metaphysical freedom. So Steiner is also aligning with Sartre, with, what Sartre will say concerning metaphysical freedom, that's the only important one. So material freedom is, I can't go out in whatever clothes I want, or lack of clothes that I want, thinking about like rules and laws. I'm not free, someone complaining that I'm not free if I can't steal the money I need and go out in the world. Or I'm not free unless my state or country does certain things, the government does certain things. So Steiner is saying that this isn't really, so this idea that to be free means to be able to do as one wants or wills or desires, he's saying that's not really freedom, because he wants to shelve that, I think, mostly because people can point out that people are not free if they're materially not free. But he wants to say everyone is free. So he likes this second proposition. To be at liberty to desire or not to desire is the real proposition involved in the dogma of free will. So to be at liberty to desire, that's your freedom. So he says, to be free means to be able of one's own accord to determine by moral imagination those mental pictures or motives which underlie my action. He says, in other words, I am free only when I myself produce these mental pictures, not when I am merely able to carry out the motives which another being has implanted in me, because maybe you're not going to be able to do that. A free being is one who can want what he himself considers right. Whoever does anything other than what he wants must be impelled to it by motives that do not lie within him. Such a man is unfree in his action. So he says, and so I think we can see, though, that not everyone has this freedom, right? If you grow up in certain ways and you don't have the ability to break out of those thinking patterns until much later in life or ever, just thinking about the discussions of feminism and the need for consciousness raising groups, because women were in some places, in some countries, and in some times were said to not even know their oppression, or not even know their subjugation, or not even know that it was possible to think something else. And I think it's not just women, it's people in various situations that have sort of this cave that they've been chained to, like think about Plato's cave, that they need to like awaken from their dream. They need to go out into the light and see what they see for themselves, instead of allowing others to orient themselves to only see shadows. So he says, external powers may prevent me from doing as I will, but then they simply condemn me to do nothing or to be unfree. Not until they would enslave my spirit, drive my motives out of my head, and put their own motives in the place of mine, do they really aim at making me unfree. So I think about 1984 and the end when, what's his name, Wilson, is taken to, I don't know if it's the Ministry of Truth or Justice or whatever it is. And it's like they want to torture him. They want him to internalize what they want him to believe. And it's hard not to do that, but you can be gaslit into thinking you're crazy, into thinking that your oppressor is right. So there is a limit. There is a place where you can be unfree. So he recognizes this. But I think he says it in a way that, like, he feels like it's impossible. So here's the interesting, we're almost finished. Here's the interesting passage, and I just basically underlined the second half of this paragraph. He says, for this reason, the church, with a capital C in my translation, sets itself not only against the mere doing, but especially against the impure thought. So this is why certain religious organizations not only care about what their parishioners do, but how their parishioners think and feel. And then they are crossing the line of where they should go and taking away someone's freedom. That is the motives of my action. The church makes me unfree if, for her, all those motives she has not herself enunciated seem impure. A church or other community produces unfreedom when its priests or teachers make themselves into keepers of consciences. That is when the faithful are obliged to go to them to the confessional for the motives of their action. And this is how religion, let's say Christianity, can be really toxic and abusive, because it can mess with your head and make you not trust yourself, make you feel ashamed for maybe things you shouldn't feel ashamed about. And it sort of puts an authoritative parental God inside of your head to direct you and punish you and reward you, I guess, if you do what it says. So he says that it is particularly significant that the right to call an act of will free arises from the experience that an ideal intuition comes to realization in the act of will. This experience can only be the result of an observation, and is so in the sense that we observe our will on a path of development towards the goal where it becomes possible for an act of will to be sustained by purely ideal intuition. This goal can be reached because in ideal intuition, nothing else is at work but its own self-sustaining essence. So he says that when this is happening, the organic activity needs to withdraw. So the body, what's organic, what's natural, what's the, animal natural nature of ourselves, it needs to withdraw to make room for the ideal activity. So I think this is really interesting because it sounds like what you're supposed to do, I guess, or some people say you're supposed to do during meditation is that you are supposed to think about how you're spirit and not body, and basically check and repress, the material world so that you can replace it by your spiritual activity. You can be open to seeing things differently, seeing in your mind's eye. He says that man is unfree insofar as he cannot complete the process of suppressing the organic activity. But he also says that this unfreedom, will tend toward freedom. That there is a directive force inherent in human nature that leads us to being able to do this. So I think that, one criticism with those philosophies that do emphasize our metaphysical freedom, or our freedom that has to do with just our thinking and our spirits and our wishes, you can imprison me, but you can't imprison my mind, have often been critiqued, and all this idea as well as of suppressing and repressing the organic, the body, mainly in my background in women's studies, because it was the argument of, let's say, 1970s feminists and others that women are particularly embodied, that we're, rewarded or punished based on our bodies. And so it's kind of a problematic suggestion to discount the body and the material and privilege the mind. And, they would say that this is a particularly looking at the mind, looking at that you're free in your mind is a part of the rational sort of Enlightenment age that can discount bodies, material freedoms that we should be activists for to change, and did I say the environment? But the environment. That said, there's something to the balance of it all. I do think it's helpful in meditation to do that. And then also Steiner's works have led to environmental activism. So I'm just thinking about, what critiques like Simone de Beauvoir would have when she's reading this, because it very much aligns with Jean-Paul Sartre's. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to continue to read The Philosophy of Freedom, or The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, as he wanted to call it, and The Riddles of Philosophy. Maybe I will make a video on the riddles of philosophy in the future. All right, thank you so much. Comment below your feedback, your thoughts, your questions, your corrections, everything. This is just a community where I'm learning, and we're learning from each other. Be well.